Thank you so much for being here. Where do I start? It's so special to be in Paris. It's my first event in Europe. I studied French literature in college, that old bag, lived in Paris as a student, have been coming back ever since, and so it's just a thrill, really, to be here in this capacity. And thank you, Grace. I'm a big fan of Grace's podcast, and so I was so thrilled when the library wrote to say that they had invited her to be in conversation with me. So thank you all for this very special night. I'm just going to read a little short excerpt from Counterfeit. This is the story of two Asian American women who band together to grow a counterfeit handbag business into a global enterprise, shattering the model minority myth along the way. And our main character is Ava Wong, a straight-laced, rule-abiding lawyer who gets pulled into her old college roommate's counterfeit handbag crime ring. So, in this little excerpt, Ava has traveled to Guangzhou in southern China, which is the fake handbag capital of the world, and she's completing her first assignment for her old roommate, Winnie. Inside the mall, I peered into shop after tiny shop, ogling the handbags crammed onto shelves like grocery cans. These lower-tier stores stocked a hodgepodge of brands, a compilation of the luxury handbag industry's greatest hits. The Gucci Dionysus next to the Fendi Baguette, next to the Louis Vuitton Speedy. The more upscale, higher-priced stores focused on single brands, Celine or Goyard or Issey Miyake's Bao Bao line in every style and color ever dreamed up. The stores in the highest tier held prime locations right by the escalators. They were spacious and decorated with intention and had actual business names like Cherished Dreams Handbags and Revive the Nation Leather Goods. Taking their cues from real designer boutiques, they displayed each bag like a sculpture beneath a single spotlight. Even their sales staff was super A quality. When I asked to take a closer look at a Chanel clutch on a high shelf, a live young woman clad in a classic tweed jacket, thigh-high cap-toed boots, and a little newsboy cap adorned with interlocking C's walked me through the replica's many virtues, from the buttery calfskin imported from France to the glistening gold-toned hardware. Across the way, a gargantuan chartreuse Birkin the size of a bassinet lured me into an immaculate store that sold only Hermès. With its opulent Instagram-ready windows featuring random accessories for the haute bourgeois life of leisure, a backgammon set crafted entirely from untreated cowhide, a glossy horse saddle and matching riding crop, this store would have not been out of place on Madison Avenue or Rue Saint-Honoré. In addition to the sizable handbag section, a corner of the store was devoted to those iconic silk scarves, another to candy-colored enamel jewelry, a third to riotously patterned dishware. I lifted a Kelly bag in a vivid amethyst shade off a shelf and turned it this way and that as though I knew what to look for. A sales associate dressed all in black except for an emerald and magenta silk triangle draped from her neck told me it was a brand new fall color. It's lovely, I admitted. How much? I converted yuan to dollars in my head and was sure I'd done the math wrong, so I sheepishly tapped the numbers into my phone. $1,400. How much did you say? I asked. She repeated the number. It's a good deal. Right, I said. I see. Winnie had said the real thing went for 12 grand, so in a sense, the associate was right. I gingerly returned the bag to the shelf and left, still firmly under the belief that no handbag, real or fake, could possibly be worth that much. No longer in the mood to explore, I went straight to the 4th floor to complete what I'd come to do. It was late morning and the mall bustled with wholesale shoppers wheeling oversized suitcases that would soon bulge with merchandise to be fanned out across shelves in Manila and Buenos Aires and Moscow. Tucked away in the very back of the complex, 0421 was modestly decorated and badly lit and had no sign above the entrance. Winnie would later assure me that their workshop produced some of the most authentic-looking bags she'd ever come across, but they kept the good stuff hidden away whenever they were tipped off about a police raid. I told the attendant, a model thin young man with hollow cheeks, that I work for Fang Wen-yi, and he offered me a stool and a glass of hot tea before calling to check on my order. "It's ready," he announced, and then went back to tapping on his phone. I looked around, wondering what I was supposed to do. Pick the bags right off the shelves? Was that the Gabrielle right there in the corner? Could I pull out my phone to discreetly compare it to the picture I'd saved earlier that morning? An older man burst into the store. He was short and muscular, sporting fashionably ripped jeans and pristine white high tops. Nice to meet you, come with me," he said, without bothering to introduce himself. I was confused. Where? Now he was confused. Where? To get your bags. "Oh," I said, "let's go." He led me down a back staircase that reeked of cigarette smoke. "You're American?" he asked, scanning me from head to toe. "Yes, that's why my Chinese is so bad." He laughed. "It's decent." "So where are we going?" I asked. He pointed into the indeterminate distance. Down the road. He walked briskly, dodging motorcycles, ignoring traffic lights, and I fought to keep up, raising the palm of my hand to drivers in both a gesture of apology and a plea for them to brake before they hit me. We passed another massive shopping center that specialized in the metal hardware that festooned bags and belts and shoes. I didn't dare ask my companion how these stores, all of which sold the same few items, could possibly survive side by side. That's how little I knew. It would take me a few more months to grasp the size and complexity of the counterfeit accessories trade. The man turned down a narrow street and stopped in front of a shabby-looking apartment building. "Here?" I asked. I'd expected a warehouse with security, maybe a receptionist. He shot me a sidelong look. Yep. He pulled out a ring of keys and unlocked the front door. I followed him down a darkened hallway, listening for any signs of life beyond the walls, sniffing the air for cooking smells. The building was eerily still. If, for some reason, I had to scream, would anyone come to my aid? He stopped before the last door at the end, and I sized him up. He was only a couple of inches taller than me, but when he pushed open the door, his forearm flexed, displaying ropey muscles, bulging veins. He flicked on a light. A slim length of neon yellow glinted in his back pocket, a box cutter. I took a step back. "Hold on," I said, pulling out my phone and studying the blank screen. "Sorry, I have to take this call." He left the door ajar. I typed a message to Winnie. "This man, older, short, muscular, wants me to go inside his apartment to get the bags. This can't be right." I stared at the screen, willing a response to appear. Who knew who else was inside that apartment waiting for a naive American to stroll right through? I removed the money from my wallet, 2 measly 20s, and jammed them into my bra. I laced my house keys between my fingers and wondered if, when push came to shove, I'd really dare gouge out an eye. I checked my phone. No response. The man's head popped out around the side of the door, startling me. "Ready?" What choice did I have? I stuffed my phone in my purse and went inside. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Sorry. Is it this working? I don't know. Is it? Oh, yeah. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten, for reading this part of the book. I think it really puts us in the in the mood of what's going to happen next. And I happen to have visited a mall like this in China, and so I can I can relate. And so this is sort of Ava Wong, and she is. She goes on board this scheme with this college roommate of hers that she hadn't seen in 10 years. And we can tell from what you just read that there are descriptions of handbags that are very detailed. And can you tell us how this idea came? Like, how did you imagine this book with this topic?
Yes, absolutely. I know it's such a random seeming topic. So it's a question that I get a good amount. And quite honestly, the initial seed of the book started as a joke. I was working on my last novel, which is a very, very different book. It's historical fiction. It's set in 1950 southern China. It's a much heavier story about a family that gets torn apart by political circumstances. And that was a book that required an incredible amount of research. And I remember one day, after a really grueling day of work, I came home and I said to my husband, who's here in the back, I said to my husband, the next book I write is going to require zero research. And it's going to have to be about the only thing that I already know a lot about, and that's handbags. And so I said that, and we laughed, and then we kind of forgot about it. And then a couple weeks later, I came across an article in the Washington Post about a real-life handbag con artist who had this perfect scheme. And it was a scheme so good that when I read it, I thought, oh, that belongs in a novel. And that's when I realized, okay, this isn't a book about handbags, but it is a book about these two women who get pulled into this counterfeit handbag scheme. And so that's how the book came about.
And also the how you chose to structure the book is very it's a real page turner, because you know the first part is a one side conversation. This character Ava Wong is talking and she's telling her side of the story, and I want to ask how how did you why did you give her all this space to state her case?
Yeah. I mean, so a lot of the book, maybe 3/4 of the book, is Ava's confession to a detective. You find out on maybe page 2 or 3 that she's talking to a detective. And I think for me, with all of my books, I often have the seed of a story, but I also often have a craft question that I'm looking to answer. And so with each of my books, I kind of try to do something different that I haven't done before. And so for this book, I was really interested in unreliable narrators, meaning narrators who tell you one thing, but aren't thinking what they're telling you. And so when you have a typical character, if you have an omniscient narrator, the character can say something like, she knew she would never be more happy than she was in the moment. And then the narrator can say, little did she know, the next day, right? So you can have a narrator behind the character telling you what the character is actually thinking. But when you have a first-person narrator, which is what I have, Ava speaking in the I, it's difficult to let the reader peer behind that I and realize that there's something else going on behind the scenes. So the character is saying one thing, and you have no other point of view. But somehow, it's an interesting project for an author to think about, how do I indicate a first-person narrator's unreliability? And so that was the question that I was really interested in. And then I also love the confession mode, because I think when you have a character confessing, firstly, there's instant tension, because if you're talking to a detective, something has gone very wrong. But the other thing is that the character motivations are really clear, because if you have a character confessing, their only goal in that moment is to go free, to convince someone of their innocence. And so not only do you have an unreliable narrator, but there's a clear motivation for their unreliability. And that, to me, is really interesting as a writer. And so that was the reason I kind of went down this path. And to be honest, initially with the first draft, I wrote the whole book in confession. And I was reading a lot of French novels at the time, and I feel like there's this like it's a very French mode, this confessional novel that's 100 pages, and it's all ambiguous because you never get to see the true story. And I really quickly saw the limitations, because I couldn't show when Ava was flat out lying, when she was exaggerating, and when she was actually telling the truth. And that's when I figured out, okay, we need a second point of view to be a counterpoint to that. So that we're not trapped in her brain. And that's when I brought Winnie in. So that's kind of how the structure grew to be.
And we do a lot of traveling with your book, because it's set between San Francisco and also Guangzhou, which is the other, like where the business takes place. But also there is a little bit of France, and because we are here in Paris and the Eiffel Tower is shimmering not far from here, I want to ask you about these elements of France that that are in the book. For example, it's very interesting the word you use, the word Frenchisms. So you place little Frenchisms in the book, and can you tell us about those? I noticed 2 of them, but can you tell us about Je t'aime? Je t'aime and tu me manques. Yeah.
Oh, yes. That's funny. Nobody has ever asked me that, because I've never done an event in Paris. But yeah, so a little bit of context. Ava is married to a half French, half American, Harvard-educated surgeon. And the reason for that was was very purposeful. And I think of Ava as this character who has lived her life following all the rules and checking all the boxes. So she's a straight A student. She goes to Stanford. She becomes a lawyer, a high, very prominent lawyer. She marries the right person. She has the right family. And so I was thinking, for a person like Ava, what is the ideal man? And many of you would know that there's a very idealization of French people in America, and so for her, to marry someone who was not only Harvard educated, not only a surgeon, but also she's kind of a fantasy person, and so when her life starts to go wrong, it's ever more devastating because she thinks, I did everything right, why am I not happy? So that was kind of the initial seed of that, and then you're right. One of the discussions she has with her husband is whether French is intentionally opaque. And I remember, the phrase you were saying, je t'aime versus je t'aime beaucoup. I remember learning that as a student, and how je t'aime beaucoup means actually I like you kind of platonically, and je t'aime is the more power. It's the opposite of how you would think it would work. And I think as somebody who loves languages, I love kind of honing in on the little things that seem very opaque to outsiders.
There's also this use of tu me manques, because in French, in English you say I miss you, so it's an active way of telling people that you are
that you are missed by me.
Exactly, yes. Which is makes then when you say this, I'm like, oh yeah, that's true. And so you have mentioned that Ava is a straight A student, that she has ticked all the boxes, that she's done everything right. And so we see throughout the book that you are playing and diffusing those stereotypes around, Asian people, but also about, like the American dream, doing things right to become that successful person that you want to be. And can you, because I think it's, I think it's great how the way you use these stereotypes, not just stereotypes, they are, because there's this unreliable character that we are, like following. And so we know that these stereotypes are used in a way that, cannot be truly stereotypes. And so growing up, how would you made aware of these stereotypes, and how did they affect your writing?
Yeah, it's a great and interesting question. I mean, I think the heart of this book, even though it's about handbags and about friendship and about women, there's so many things going on, but the heart of it to me was always two women subverting the model minority myth. And that, I'm sure you're all familiar with the model minority myth, but it's this idea that a certain group of people in America, mostly East Asians in America, are rule-abiding, submissive, hardworking. And sometimes you hear those traits and you say, well, that seems pretty good. Like, what are you complaining about? But I think that's kind of why the myth is so insidious, is that it makes you feel like you should be grateful for it. But some of the flip sides of that is that it pits people of color against each other, because it's an easy way for the larger society to say, well, if one group of people could make it, then the reason another group didn't make it is because they didn't try, right? So that's one thing. It pits people of color against each other. The other thing is that it collapses differences amongst East Asians, and it just assumes that everybody is a certain way. So there are all these reasons why the myth can actually end up being harmful. And it's interesting because I actually grew up in Singapore, where the majority is 80% of the country is ethnic Chinese, almost 80% is ethnic Chinese. And so I actually grew up as part of the majority and was not aware of the model minority myth until I moved to the US. And so that, I think, that's really helpful for a writer, to kind of have your foot in two places and to always be on the outside, because you observe things that people who are entrenched in the system or in the society take for granted. And so I remember coming to the US as a child. I was 15 when I went to boarding school, and I remember my mom saying, don't forget you're a guest in the country. And from her perspective, and over time she had lived in the US, she had gone to school there before she went back to Singapore, and she, not using the exact words, but she did kind of explain the model minority myth, and in a way that she sort of implied that we were lucky that that I was lucky that I would be seen that way when I moved to the US. And I understand what she was saying because, yes, in a way, you're lucky to be seen in fairly positive traits. And I think that you're lucky if you're a guest and don't plan to stay. And it's only when you realize that, wait, this is my home and I'm seen as an outsider, no matter how many generations I've spent in the country, that you start to see the real problem with that myth. And so that's kind of how I was made aware of it. Now that I've lived in the US for longer than I've lived in Singapore, now that I identify as Asian American, now that I'm, very close friends with other people that friends who have grown up in the US who are Asian American, I've really sort of I can really see the flip side of it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how you wrote this, because as an Asian writer, I mean, like writer of Asian descent, I always wonder, it's very important for me to avoid stereotypes in my writing. And so am I going to perpetuate something, or am I writing something that no one can relate to because it doesn't, no one has ever seen this, it's stereotypes are not, bad per se. They are, just like shortcuts in people's minds. Some are really bad, and some, are just images that you keep in your mind as you grow up and you understand things. And so I like the way that you use them to, like they're part of the story, they have an agenda, and that's so smart to use them that way and there's so many things in what you say that I can identify with, and because when you said because you were born in Singapore, you were part of the majority, and then you moved to some place where you didn't look like everybody else in the street, and I can find these little things in your book. I suppose they were drawn from your experience. How when she says she goes to Guangzhou for the first time, and she's in the airport and she thinks, oh, all these people can be my relatives. And this is something truly that I suppose in Singapore that's not what you didn't think about this when you were in Singapore. But for me, as a person who lived, I was born and raised here. So when I go somewhere where I'm part of the majority, I feel so at home. I feel at home in every Chinatown because I get all these words that I understand. And also when she says that, every time she apologizes because she cannot speak good Mandarin or good Cantonese, this is something that I do all the time, right? Because I look Chinese, but I don't speak Chinese. People are upset about me. They say, oh, but you're fake Chinese. And then I think fake and real, is this something that, that is in the heart of your book? Who's the real Ava and who's the real Winnie? And are they really what they think they are? Like they're pretending to be all the, well, I won't tell you anything, because I know some of you are halfway through the book, and I don't want.
Yeah, but I think also the way that within the Asian community, everybody is stereotyping each other, right? So, Ava is born and raised in Massachusetts. She's Asian American, and Winnie, the other character in the book, the other main character, who is her old college roommate, moved from China for college, and so they're also looking at each other with that same lens. And Ava looks at Winnie and thinks like, oh, you're from China, like you're conniving, maybe you cheated, there's an SAT scandal that happens pretty early on, and everybody suspects that Winnie cheated on her SATs. And then Winnie looks at Ava and thinks like, oh, you Asian Americans, you're so naive, you haven't seen anything in the world, you're so innocent, right? And so I think it's also, which is another thing the model minority myth does, is which it collapses differences between people and just assumes, it paints with a very broad brush when really there's so much nuance within. It's a huge community. I mean, there's so many different kinds of people contained within that.
Yeah, I think I myself, I hadn't heard that term, my model minority myth for a long time. I think I was really fooled by this myth. I really thought that my parents were hardworking because I heard that Asians are hardworking, and I thought, hey, it's true, my parents are hardworking. That must be true then, it's like from my own experience. And yes, they're very discreet, and I thought, yeah, my parents don't talk too much, but so that must be true, and everything kind of just self, I just thought, and then I realized, oh, well, they just work hard because they came from another country and they are not returning, and And so, the only way is to make your own way. And then it's not because they're discreet, but because they have a hard time with the language here. Right. And that, it's nothing to do with, there's nothing cultural or genetic about the myth. It's just a myth, which means it's not. No, it's not true.
I have to say too, I love the story that you told this in your I told you I listened to your interview with Lauren Bastida many years ago, but you told the story about how your teachers thought you were a good student even though you were average, and that even though you were not getting good grades, they were very determined that you were a good student, and they would not see you for who you really are. And so, I mean, it was a very funny story the way you told it, but you could see how that could be very harmful if somebody's not good at something and you just insist, like, you are good at math, you must go down this path, and I think that's a kind of very clear example of people not seeing you for who you are.
It happened to my kid recently. I have a son, and he went to what we call le collège, which is middle school, and he said, oh, there was a ping pong table and he said, oh, we started playing with all the kids, and mother, I lost. And my friend said, oh, I thought you were good at this. And he thought, how could I ever be good at ping pong if we don't have a ping pong table at home? Mom, get me one. And I was like, wow, how did you turn this around to make me feel so bad that I didn't get you a ping pong table like my father got me a table when I was little. And I also love the fact that in this book you place a lot of elements of Chinese culture, but in many places, not just where we expect them. And there's the Chinese nursery rhyme from your child that I know too. Liang Zhi Liao, about the tigers, right? And also obviously the mouth-watering food descriptions when Ava goes to restaurants with her family in Hong Kong, and also that I really like that part when you talked about the fleshy earlobes. Because this is something that I was told when I was growing up. Oh, everyone with a fleshy earlobe, that's sign of good luck. And so I would look for a husband later on. He has great earlobes. I love it. and I really, this is little things that really make my day when I read your book. Is this something important for you to place these, not just because they're part of the story, because Ava is Asian American and Winnie is also Asian American, and because so they're part of the story. But is it something for you that you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think about it from a broader perspective. And what I was thinking about when I wrote those details was that I wanted to write this book for Asian readers and for Asian American readers, and that was kind of where I started. And then because of that, I didn't feel like I needed to explain a lot of these things. And I knew that the right readers would the right readers would know, and that the readers who didn't know would either find it interesting and look it up, or just kind of, it wouldn't detract. And I think that is something that took me a lot of confidence. It took me years to develop that kind of confidence, because I think when I was starting out, it seemed unconceivable that I wouldn't write to the largest audience possible if my goal is to get published, right? Like, it's like, obviously I want everybody to read this book, and so I need to tell this story to everyone. And so with my first novel, Soy Sauce for Beginners, which is set in contemporary Singapore, another very different book, I sometimes felt like I was being a tour guide to my welcome to Singapore. Let me tell you about our tiny island. And I thought I had no choice. And with years of, with my second and third book subsequently, I thought sometimes in trying to write to everyone, you end up writing to no one, and it's more important to reach the people you really want to speak to. And you hope everybody comes along, but I think so. I think that was where I started, was kind of, okay, I know who I'm telling this story to, and then it just became natural that, because I had such a clear idea of who I was writing to, that these details would make it into the book. And then also they're very true to the character, right? Because Ava's mother, her parents are from Hong Kong, and when the book opens, her mother has recently passed away. And so on top of that, there's this added fraught layer of how am I going to pass on my heritage to my child when I don't even have my mom anymore, and I'm Asian American and I don't speak the language. I think there's this really real sense of stress that a lot of immigrants and children of immigrants go through when they're, when they feel like they're now the passer of traditions and they never even learned them properly. And it's just a kind of added layer of of discomfort that we find the character in the beginning of the book.
I think it's a great tip, a great writing tip, that if you write if you think you're going to write for everybody, you're writing for nobody. Because it makes me think that, here in France, we have no such thing as the word Asian American, in translation. We don't say, France is based on, what we call universalism. So in our constitution, we mention that there is no such thing as race. And so there is, we wouldn't say there is an Asian French literature. So we wouldn't say I wouldn't be able to say I'm writing for my fellow Asian French, because we are all French, full stop. And so I want to ask you, how do you describe yourself, or how are you described? Are you described as an Asian American writer, or is it something that is a problem, or is it something that you embrace, or are you Singaporean, Asian writer? Does it make a difference for you?
Yeah, that's so interesting what you were saying. I mean, I think there are some very, very noble things about this idea in France that everybody is French, full stop. I think that can be a wonderful idea. But I didn't anticipate the other part, which is that maybe a sense of community amongst a particular group is harder to find, because you don't define yourselves in that way. That's really, really interesting. I have to think about that more. But yes, no, I do identify. It took me actually years to identify as Asian American. Because I grew up in Singapore, because my parents live there, because I'm still Singaporean. I'm not, technically I'm not American. I don't vote, for instance, because I have a Singaporean citizenship. And I think I identify as all of the above: Asian American, Asian, Singaporean American. And I think it is important for me to identify in that way, because I think that in the US at least, so few books center Asian American readers. So as a writer, I feel like that's one thing that I can do, is center Asian American readers. And so I don't anticipate writing a book that doesn't have at least one Asian main character in it, because there's already not that many books that do it. And so, I think that's a small thing that I can do, and also those are the stories that I'm interested in. So yes, I fully accept that, embrace that identification. Are there challenges? Yes. I mean, I think that publishing in the US has changed a lot, and there are many, many prominent Asian American writers, especially in the last decade or so, but I think it is still a small number in terms of percentage. And I also think that there are a lot of challenges that come with being seen as an Asian American writer. I mean, to give you a very small example, when I published this book, one of the things that really caught me by surprise was that I heard from some Asian readers who said, I don't want to read a book that's about Asians being criminals, kind of gleeful criminals. And so there was kind of flip side being like, why are you portraying us in a negative light? And that I really didn't anticipate. But as I think about it more, I think that it can be uncomfortable, but it's a good position to be in, because there is room and space for the good immigrant story. So the story of an immigrant who worked really, really hard and escaped incredible circumstances to come to a new country and to make their life. I think that's an absolutely valuable, worthy story, but I think it's not the only story. And I think that there needs to be room for different kinds of stories. And so I aspire to a day when when an Asian Nabokov can write Humbert Humbert and not be afraid that we're going to think all white men are pedophiles, right? Like, if we get to that point, that's real representation. And you can't get to that point if people aren't writing different kinds of immigrant stories. And so it is challenging, because if you're doing something that hasn't really been seen, there will be pushback. I was very, very lucky that my publisher embraced this book, and that I was floored by the reception. But it could have also gone the other way, where people said, like, oh, I don't want to read a book that glorifies criminality and whatever. It doesn't, by the way. It's satirical. We all understand satire. But I think when you're doing something new, there's always going to be pushback. And so I try to see it as a privilege. You know, like how, if I'm contributing to the next person writing a different kind of book, what a wonderful place to be in.
Yeah, I totally understand and what you said, and for French writers, I think also because like a lot of the migrations from Asia to France or to Europe in general, France has like the largest Southeast Asian community in Europe. And so it's quite recent in, you know, like the history of Europe, because it will, like a lot of the migrations will date back to the 1970s and early 80s, even though, you know, they have been since the 19th century and are still coming in now, of course. But the image that we have is the, quote, boat people. And so it's quite recent. And so because it's recent, there is a second, third generation, like right now, who are French and who are doing, you know, the writing, the arts, every type of businesses. And whenever there's a new path, there's a lot of expectations. And so when you're one of the first ones to do something, whether it's, you know, opening a restaurant with that type of food, or like offering new services, people will be expecting you to be perfect. And you know how when we expect perfection, then, you know, you can only fail. Yes. And I think right now this is also, you know, we expect you to write this or that because you look you're Asian, or you look Asian. And I think it's great that you have this freedom of being, you know, like who you are, and really giving us the book that you wanted, because it's a great book, and because you were free, it's a great book.
Yes, and that's such a good point. And I think that the reason I felt that freedom is because I was from Singapore. It actually never occurred to me until the book published that people would hone in on the fact that they hadn't read a book with two Asian female protagonists who are kind of gleefully committing crimes. And somebody was like, oh, this is really groundbreaking. But I'm from Singapore, so it wasn't. You know what I mean? Like, our art is... there is a lot of art about Asian people doing all sorts of things, and we don't even think about it. And so I think sometimes as a writer, that kind of ignorance can serve you. You know, you have a little bit of, you know, I'm glad it took me by surprise, because I think if I understood at the outset that I was really kind of breaking a mold in some way, I might have censored myself, you know. And so, what a privilege to have to be able to live in different places and to be able to see things from different perspectives.
It's true. When I think this is going to be one of my last questions, because we're coming to the end of the conversation. I published a novel in 2018, and I remember one time a journalist asked me, he said, oh, but there's no white character in your book. And I thought, that's right. And I thought, you know, why would you ask me that? You know, does it have to be a white character? Because there's a white character, but he's kind of goofy, you know, and so they weren't satisfied with that character, you know. It wasn't, you know, essential enough. And so that, you know, it kind of like, you know, and it's a
question that a white author would never get, is the point.
Absolutely, yeah. Obviously. And also I want to end with this, because we know how after the pandemic there was a surge in anti-Asian racism all over the world, especially, you know, in Europe and in the US. And I want to ask, what do you think that literature can do to fight oppression in general, and how do you see your work in this puzzle?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I feel like the most radical thing I can do is to center an Asian American readers, which is such a tiny thing. But I think that growing up in Singapore, I never read a book that was written for me, even though I just said all of our art is, a lot of art made in Singapore is made by Singaporeans, about Singaporeans. But in school, we only read British and American literature. And I grew up in the 80s, so I think it's changed quite a bit. But I mean, I didn't even know that Singaporeans could be authors, because we had never read books that were written, you know, by Singaporean writers for Singaporean readers. And so I think that as a writer, that is one of the reasons why I set out to do that, and why I think it is important. Because I think even 2 decades ago, let's say, a lot of the kind of our seminal Asian novels had to be written for a broad audience, because they would never have been published otherwise. And so I think that now that we can do that, we must. And I think I also push back a little bit on this idea that the goal of literature is to create empathy, which I think every now and then you have this in the New York Times just published. Oh, studies show that people who read fiction have more empathy for people of other races, for instance, or people of other circumstances. And of course that is important, but I also think that if your end goal is empathy, that is almost too limiting. You know, like we should have empathy for other people because they're human. And if our only goal is empathy, it kind of shuts down the number of stories that you can tell, right? If my only goal is to create empathy, I have to write a certain kind of character who's a certain, it goes back a little bit to what I was alluding to with the good immigrant narrative, which is absolutely a true and important narrative, but it can't be our only narrative. And I think that if our only goal is empathy, it kind of limits the number of topics that we can address. And so I think we should take empathy as the starting point and then write what we want to write, you know?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kirstin.
We're now, excuse me, we're now going to open this conversation up to questions from our audience. So we'll start with our in-person audience and then turn to Zoom audience if we have time. Don't be shy. Yes, first hand shot up.
Thank you. This conversation was so pleasurable, and your book is so pleasurable to read. And I'm surprised, you know, reading it, I was thinking, this has such mass appeal. So it's actually the opposite of what you were saying. I thought, oh, I could recommend this to anyone. I can't wait to see it made into a movie. So I'd love to hear any plans about that. But I was really struck by the pacing. The pacing is so super tight, and it's a page turner, but without using any of the traditional tricks of making something a page turner. So any thoughts about pacing?
Thank you for saying it has mass appeal. I mean, I think that's absolutely, but I think that is the kind of paradox of writing. It's that the more specific you are, the more universal you are, right? And so, but I think it takes confidence, especially as a young writer. That wasn't something, even though people told me that wasn't something I could really believe. But thank you for pointing out the pacing. I think pacing is really important to me as a writer and as a reader, and so it's something that I work very hard on. In terms of how you achieve pacing, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I think that I've always been a writer who kind of naturally shuns long passages of description, for one thing. I've always kind of honed in. I always think one detail that indicates the larger whole is more effective, and so I think that's maybe an aesthetic thing. But I'm glad that it pays off.
Other questions? Yes.
So just to give some context, I'm a gemologist, so I was particularly interested with the mention of lab-grown diamonds at the end. So I was just wondering where that kind of part came from, or how that happened.
Yes, there's a tiny thread in the book that is sort of forward-looking. It doesn't get fully fleshed out, where the women talk about a scheme that involves switching out mined diamonds for lab-grown diamonds, which are a good bit cheaper, but which are chemically identical to mined diamonds. And so as far as I know, you have to be a really, really true expert to see the difference, and that most jewelers will take out their loupe and look at it, and they can't tell. Like, you need to have more expertise. Is that right so far? Oh, good, okay. And I thought, this is a book about authenticity and what makes something real and what makes something fake. And I thought diamonds were the absolute perfect metaphor for it, because if chemically they're exactly the same and not even an expert looking through a loupe can tell the difference, then what really gives one thing value and the other thing less value? I mean, the point being that I think we like to think about objects as having objective or intrinsic value, and that's a question that's something that the book calls into question. It's really, where do our value systems come from?
Other questions?
Hello. It was so nice to hear your conversation. And I just wanted to thank you, actually, for voicing out the fact you said that there's an anxiety with hyphenated writers who feel the need to fit into one kind of category or ethnicity or something, because I'm writing a story right now, and I was really conflicted because my character hates the fact that he's brown, and he sort of, because he grows up in this classical trained Britain, and I was very worried about that because I thought perhaps that says something negative about me, because I'm not ashamed, because I grew up everywhere, like you said as well. So hearing you say it out loud kind of made me realize that, you know, it's okay to have characters who are equally or more conflicted than you are. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also that, you know, that we were talking about, you know, being identified as an Asian writer, the things that you say in your community that you don't necessarily say outside of your community, but when you're writing a book, you are saying it in the kind of loudest way that you could say it. And so I think that's hard too. And I think that that readers will have different reactions. And like I said earlier, you know, I have learned to kind of see those reactions as a privilege. Like, I understand why Asian readers read my books and want certain things from it, because there are so few Asian books that make a bestseller list or, you know, get turned into a TV show. Things like, you know, there's so few of us. And so I understand wanting to kind of pin all your hopes on Crazy Rich Asians, the movie, or whatever it is, right? It's like, we only have that movie, like, please do well so that we can make more of them. And it's so much pressure, but it's such a privilege. And so I try to kind of focus on the privilege. You know, there's very few things that a lot of us will do in life where you're actually moving the conversation forward or breaking ground in some small way. It's, you know, so few people will have that experience. And so hopefully, you know.
Can I also add that I think it's really important that you write what you want to write, as Kirstin, you know, did. But I'm also aware that as non-white writers, we are expected to deliver our, you know, what we go through and things. Sorry, is it not working? Oh, okay, sorry. That, you know, we're expected to give our, you know, what we go through up for consumption, because it's, you know, a capitalistic system, and that's what, you know, sometimes that's where we, you know, we get all the, you know, oh, that's what she does. Oh, that's what we want. We want her to say her community is bad and that they hate it and that they want to be saved. And I think that's the type of discourse that we have read, and sometimes we disagree. And so it's really hard. It's a conflict. It's a conflict. You know, you don't want to be the person who will be, even though it happens, you know, in French we say laver son linge sale en public, which means to wash your dirty clothes in public, which, you know, and something that you don't want to do because you don't want to give them any weapons against you. But then, so I think the key word in everything that we do is that we want to, you know, like, it's about dignity. It's about telling your story with dignity, because yes, we are complex people. We have complex characters, and so they are going to keep their dignity because they're telling it from their heart, and they're not telling it because that's what, you know, that's the only thing they want from us, you know. But I think it's a really difficult exercise, and that it takes a lot of sincerity. But I'm sure, you know, I hope you can do it too.
Other questions in the room? Yeah.
We were talking about community. I wanted to know, for you, how did you find community? How did you, like, realize that you were fully American and Asian also? And how do you view us, French Asian? Because it's so difficult for us to make community, to be a community. So yeah, how did you do that?
Yeah, how did you? It's an interesting question. I mean, I think so. I went to graduate school in Boston, where I got my MFA, and I had a really, really rich writing community there because I was in graduate school. But actually, I didn't. Almost none of my close writing friends in graduate school were Asian American, and I didn't think I needed it. I felt so enriched and so supported. And then I moved to San Francisco, where a lot of Asian American writers live. And that's where I kind of just happened into to find my group of friends, close group of friends. And that's when I realized I was missing out this whole time. And that and I happened to have a group of 4 or 5 Asian American women writers in San Francisco. And now I live in New York, and I've managed to find another group of Asian American women writers. And I think there are things that we go through in the industry and in academia that are very particular to being a woman of color. And I did not realize until I had found that group that how much I was, how much I needed from them, and how much joy I get from being a part of that community. And so what I have found, at least in the US, is that people are welcoming, and especially writers, because we work alone so much. I think everybody is looking for the same thing that everybody was looking for the same thing that I was, and so it wasn't difficult. How you would do that in France? I think, Grace, you might have a more insight into this than I do in terms of finding community.
Well, it's true about what we said earlier, is that the myth of universalism is great on paper because it means, oh yes, equal rights, because that's on the paper, it's up front. And we have the liberté, égalité, fraternité devise of France. And so, but also means that within the word community is like it's like a bad word. You don't need it. You don't need it because everybody is your community, and that really breaks the solidarity that could be. We often say in France, oh yeah, no, we don't need community. Community is for Americans. They have the melting pot. And that's their thing. We are better than this. And so the consequences are that sometimes you think you grow up in your community and you don't share the same experience, and then you realize that there is no mirror between what you go through and what the majority of the people around you go through, and they cannot understand you, although you understand everything that they live, and what their country house looks like, even though you don't have a country house, right? Because you've seen the TV shows and you've read the books, and you know how skiing feels like, even though you've never been to the Alps. Yes. And so this is something that happens when you're a minority person in a country, in a place where you're that will not. That doesn't recognize that there are minority groups, and so this is I suppose I guess talking about it and saying this thing, it will. I don't know that I have obviously I'm Asian French, and I really like it. I feel weird saying Asian French because I don't really say it in French. Yes. We don't have a word. How in the US now you say Asian American. Yeah. It was coined in the 1990s by academia, and now it's still a fiction, but it will draw equal rights claims. AAPI is a fiction, but it still is something that exists politically. Yes. We don't have that in France, so we say Français d'origine asiatique, so French of Asian origins, or we say Franco-Chinois, so you have Franco-Chinois, which is French and Chinese, or French Asian. But so see, it's just when you don't have a word to say something, it means that thing doesn't exist. But if you can't name it, it means there's no problem. And if you can't think of a problem, well, there's no solution, obviously. And so this is something that I think we're trying to work on here in France, because we need to put our finger and put the name on racism or exclusion to be able to find solutions. And I guess
Have you found a community of Franco-Asian writers or like-minded?
Yes, absolutely. I think there are more and more writers now that are publishing and are making their way in the system. But I think I personally think that old Europe, and especially France, is it's very hard. It's smaller than the USA, right? So it's like a state. It would be a state in the USA, right? And so our audience is limited because of the language, because of Yeah, because of how the administration is. Because France is very centralized. You come from a federal place. In the U.S. is a federal place, so there's there's something that you need in the state, and then there's the country, right? We don't have that kind of. Everything is in Paris. We are in Paris right now, and this is like the cultural center for the country, and so it's really hard also for writers who do not live here to be part of this community. So yes, I have found people, but you have to be living here. You have to go to events here. You have to, and that's exclusion. That's excluding people who cannot be with us. And so I think this is something that's ongoing, and that we're trying to build despite all these obstacles, these challenges. And I think we look up to what's being done out elsewhere, but I think that's not enough. We have to really build our own thing and compare it with others.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, but what it sounds like is that it is something that everybody's looking for, and I think that is a big thing. That that everybody's looking for the thing that you are also looking for, and so that is better than if you were the only one looking for it. It sounds like it's it's not, but more complicated than that.
We have time for one final question. Last chance. Is there anyone on Zoom? I have a final question then, before we head out. Kirstin, I was so struck when I was reading about you ahead of this event to learn about your writing routine and your relationship to structure and discipline. Could you tell us a little bit about how that informs your creative practice?
Yes. I always hesitate to talk about it because it takes all the romanticism out of writing. But I am a very, very regimented person and writer. When I'm working on a draft, I meditate, I do yoga, I turn off my internet, and I draft 1,000 words a day that I then send to my close friend, the writer Matthew Salisis, and he sends me his 1,000 words over email, and then we give each other a thumbs up or a thumbs down, no comments. And that's how I draft my books. And the reason for that is because I think that anybody who is a writer knows that you have no deadlines. Nobody cares when you finish your book. My publisher waits a year. I take 4 years for each book, so they don't care if I take 4.5 years or 5 years or 3.5 years. For them, it's the same. And so I just needed to find, when I graduated from my MFA program, I needed to find a way to keep myself on track. And so that's this kind of like draconian method that I came up with my close friend from grad school. But now that I've done that for 3 books and over 10 years, I actually take a lot of pleasure and joy from the rigidity. And I found that when you're writing 1,000 words a day, it just takes the stakes away, because 1,000 words is nothing. And so I could write 1,000 really shitty words, and tomorrow if my friend says these are bad, I delete them and I start over. And it just doesn't become fraught. And so this idea of like, oh, I have to write the perfect sentence and the perfect draft, and somebody's gonna read it, and everything needs to be in place, like that is so much pressure. That it can often, that's I think the root of a lot of writer's block, is that people feel too much pressure to keep going, or they edit themselves too frequently and then they can't make enough progress on their books. And so when I'm drafting, I just want to kind of take my editor brain out of it and just get in the rhythm of it. And I really think of it like practicing scales or lifting weights at the gym. Like it's just something you do every day and you build the muscle. And if you write 1,000 words a day, you put all those days together, you get a book at the end of that, and then you revise, and it takes a lot of other things, but the first draft is really important, and that's the way that I do it.